You have no doubt heard that Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau proposed a set of reforms to the Canadian tax code this summer. The Liberals say they will close loopholes and make the tax system fairer. That is definitely not how a growing chorus across several sectors sees it. Joining us now to assess the government's plans in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Karen Stillwell, partner at Connor Stillwell, a corporate and tax law firm. In the nation's capital, David McDonald, senior economist, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. In Waterloo, Ontario, via Skype, Tammy Sherrill, professor of economics, Wilfrid Laurier University, and director of their Centre for Economic Research and Policy Analysis. And here in our studio, Dan Kelly, president of the CFIB, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Dan, good to have you back in that chair. It's been a long time since we've had you here. And to our three guests in Points Beyond, we appreciate you joining us on TVO tonight. Let's start with this quick backgrounder here just to get us up to scratch on where things are at. Since the 1970s, there has been an 8-fold increase in the number of corporations in this country. Why is that significant? Well, because today there is a 37.2% gap between personal tax and business tax rates. And that means that income coming from a business faces a much lower tax burden. David, I want to go to you first. How do you explain the significant rise in incorporation over the past several years?
Well, that's right. And particularly for small businesses, there's a lot more money going through small businesses. And so I think one of the concerns, of course, is that the small business accounting structure is actually being used by professionals that are not really running small businesses, they're just using it as a means to income split, for instance, or create their own personal retirement systems that bypass all the rules that everybody else lives by in the RRSP and TFSA system. And so I think the real concern for the federal government is that these are not new small businesses that are providing goods and services via small businesses. They're professionals using the small business structure to reduce their tax bill.
Tammy Sherrill, for people who are watching this who don't have a small business, why would they care about the difference in the income tax rate?
Well, I think the key thing here is that we're trying to achieve some really important fundamental principles with our tax system. At the end of the day, one thing that we want to achieve is what we call neutrality. And here we want to make sure that businesses are making decisions because they're good business decisions. Where markets work well, we want to leave them alone. We don't want people to structure their businesses for tax purposes. And I think the thing here is that we see people making decisions about how to incorporate or not for those tax purposes. Anytime we distort business decisions this way, it's inefficient and it's bad for growth.
Well, once again, let's do a little more background here just to help people get up to scratch on this, because one tax avoidance scheme that the Liberals want to restrict is something called income sprinkling or income splitting. And again, bring this up if you would, Sheldon. This is a practice in which a business owner in a high income tax rate can reduce the total amount of tax paid by his or her family by quote-unquote sprinkling income to family members in lower tax brackets. And the impact of all of that, of clamping down on all of that, would be the changes would have an impact on 50,000 Canadian families who are using this strategy, and the federal government estimates it'll mean recouping $250 million annually in tax revenue. And again, Karen, let's go to you on this and a little background first. Why do so many people tax sprinkle or tax income split to begin with?
Well, people do it because the system that's in place incentivizes that and provides a means for that. Income splitting is something that's been part of our system for going back decades. One of the purposes of the tax system that we have right now is to incentivize entrepreneurship. So the system has put in place a variety of incentives. Income splitting is one of those. The reason to do it is that it does, as you mentioned, it lowers the overall household tax burden. From my perspective, there's no reason why a small business owner or somebody who's running their business through a corporation shouldn't take advantage of that if that is what the system is meant to accomplish.
Yes, and Dan, let's be clear about this. There's nothing illegal about it. It's not tax evasion. It is legal tax avoidance. The code allows for it. Do you think it's legit?
Absolutely. I mean, income sprinkling is one of the three measures the government's pursuing. These are important pieces of the current tax system in Canada. The reason why I think that we have to look at this a little bit differently when you're talking about an entrepreneur is there are a variety of formal and informal ways that all family members are involved in a business, and most notably is risk-taking. You know, an employee, of course, it affects an employee's family if say, the main breadwinner loses their job, no question. But in a family business setting, you're actually starting not at zero, you're starting usually in the hole because the family home is mortgaged, they perhaps put their payroll on their credit cards in a tough month. The success of the family rises and falls with the business itself. And I think it's a misunderstanding if you're suggesting that only that one person who may be leading the charge in the business is going to be able to benefit from some of the tax provisions that are set out.
I hear you, but I think the federal government is making a distinction between the example you just gave and, say, you know, an independent consultant who perhaps has a second business on the side that is in effect just a shell corporation and doesn't really make any goods or services, but is just there as a kind of a holding pit for money. What about that?
One of our main complaints is that this doesn't distinguish between those things at all. This is a broad brush that's going to affect every business at every income level, and the information coming out of the federal government sadly is completely wrong. They are suggesting this is a very targeted measure at a few people, targeted at professionals. Every business owner is going to be facing these same things. And for the professionals themselves, I think it is, I think, a big insult to professionals to suggest that they are not business owners, that they are not taking risks. I understand that the governments have problems with doctors specifically because they are paid by the public purse in many instances. At the same time, the degree of risk that these entrepreneurs are taking and the other satellite services that they're offering, the economy has changed. The service economy has grown. And that's one of the reasons why there are so many more people incorporated today than there were in the past.
David McDonald, follow up on that, if you would, by telling us whether you think this income sprinkling or income splitting is a phenomenon that is being abused at the moment.
Well, this is the same debate that we had in 2015 when income splitting was under discussion at the federal level, except it was for everyone. It wasn't just for small business owners. And one of the important points to make is you got to make money to make this worthwhile. So to get the full benefit of income splitting, you've got to have a particular family structure, which is you've got one sole earner and you've got either a spouse or adult children or adult seniors in the house that make no income. And you've got to make a lot of money to get the full value. So, you know, if you make $300,000, then you can income split with your spouse, and you probably benefit in the neighborhood of $25,000. That's a lot of money to spend on a household that's already making $300,000. You know, the mom and pop shop that's clearing $50K from their pizza shop, they can't income split because the benefits are so small or totally non-existent. This is a pay-to-play system, so it's not a simple setup. I mean, you've got to pay accountants to get in there and set up your business, maintain the structure such that you can continue to income split. And it's pay-to-play, and so it makes the most sense for the richest households. You know, if you're a small business owner, you don't make that much, income splitting is not really of any use to you. And so in that sense, it's got a very perverse incentive structure. Moreover, if you don't have anyone to income split with, or say your other spouse works, then you can't income split either. And so it's a very odd incentive structure if what you're trying to reward is is entrepreneurship.
Karen, let me put a real life example to you, because you know, it's interesting. Just the other day, I was having a conversation with somebody who's a small business owner who said to me, my wife is on the payroll. She's a vice president of my company. I'm not sure she even knows the address of where the company is. Clearly, it's an attempt to, again, legally avoid paying as much tax as they clearly don't have to pay. But, you know, why are those, in that case, certainly, seemingly perverse incentives in the tax system to begin with?
Well, I disagree with characterizing the incentives as perverse to begin with. The incentives are there, and they are there for a reason. The system that we have in place is there to incentivize entrepreneurship, and the idea is, like I said earlier, to spread out the overall tax burden across the family for the reasons that we've already discussed. But one point that I would like to make is that reasonable people can disagree about whether we should have income splitting to the extent that we do, and whether we should have rules that curtail it or modify income splitting. The problem is that by describing what the government is doing as closing loopholes, the government is suggesting that all of these mechanisms are only available to, like they say, the rich, the wealthy, and the high income. In fact, we see that families where a A wife and a husband could be splitting income $50,000 each, a total of $100,000, are going to be severely affected by these rules. Certain other rules that you could run afoul of that the government is proposing take people out of their lower tax bracket and force income to be taxed at an even higher tax bracket, the highest tax. Those are perverse consequences of what the government has suggested.
Tammy, the finance minister has said, however, that he wants to introduce what he calls a reasonableness test to catch people that he thinks are sort of finessing the system a bit too much. Any sense, Tammy, about how that would work?
So we're waiting to see exactly how that language develops. I think some people who are tax professionals have identified that the way it's currently written might not be as effective as intended. The intention here is that when you have a family business that is structured, like the family farm, everyone in the business is working on the farm. They are legitimately part of the business and being paid as part of that business. They shouldn't be affected by these provisions at all. What we're trying to capture here is going back to these neutrality principles. We don't want to create incentives to incorporate for tax purposes. And we also have these equity principles. When we see two business owners who are otherwise identical, we need to rationalize why one of those business owners deserves a higher return on their risk than the other. And I think that's an important issue here.
Dan, I think everybody understands the family farm example where everybody is pitching in and contributing to the health of the organization. But speak to the example I just gave where the guy is sprinkling income to his wife who's never even been to the office, even though she's a vice president of the company.
Yes. So look, there are scenarios like that where I would suggest the main objective of the tax provisions are exactly as was suggested by Karen, and that is to ensure that the overall burden of taxation on the entrepreneurs is made lower to incent people to go into entrepreneurship in the beginning. But the bigger concern that I have is that these changes, especially with the reasonable test that's proposed, and to be fair, there is already in the CRA legislation a reasonable test that has been walked through the courts many, many times, and business owners know about it. But the new provisions that they're talking about making, we believe, are going to create, at minimum, a decade of uncertainty for business owners so that you don't know whether you can pay your employee X or Y if they happen to be a family member. And that is one of the big concerns that we have, is the uncertainty. And it may incent people from not having family members involved in their business in the first place. Who is going to make the decision as to whether, if a spouse is there preparing lunch for the people that are working on the farm,
get that. Dan, I totally get that.
Are prepared and
let me jump
hard.
in here for a second, please, Dan. I totally get that. However, do you think it is an illegitimate, in terms of public policy desire, for the finance minister to have people prove that they legitimately have earned their salaries and dividends as a contributing member of a company? So
look, right from the very beginning of this process, the reason that we didn't light our hair on fire as soon as the finance minister proposed these changes is we wanted to walk through them a little bit to find out how far they went. I think the business community didn't start to freak out right away. But after tax professionals started to suggest how broad these rules were, the business community spontaneously combusted. And that's why there's so much anger towards MPs right now with respect to not just the policy changes, but the tone that the government has taken. We have said right from the beginning, though, that every single piece of the Income Tax Act is subject to some abuse. And if the government is sincere in those efforts and wants to sit down with the business community broadly to look at ways to shore that up, to tighten up some of the rules, we are 100% prepared to do that. But don't do this. Don't just push all of these changes through with a limited consultation started over the summer, suggest that, make it out that the business community is somehow a bunch of tax cheats, and then try to say, okay, but these are just minor changes, minor tweaks to the system. That's one of those two things is not true.
Let me pick up on that, because you mentioned tone and you mentioned the notion of sort of portraying the business community as a bunch of tax cheats, which I know has been, deeply insulting to many people in the business community. Here's Bill Morneau, the finance minister. Speaking of tone, check out 49 seconds of the finance minister. Roll it, please.
In other cases, some people may be paying less than their fair share for the essential services that Canadians rely on. And this is becoming an even more pressing issue as Canadian-controlled private corporations are making up an ever-growing share of our GDP, doubling in the last 15 years. I want to be clear. This isn't about a business not paying its share. It's about people using a corporate structure to shield their income and to gain a tax advantage. We know that middle-class Canadians work hard to provide better lives for their families. They expect the government to put in place rules that will help grow the economy and create jobs, and also to ensure that these rules are not taken advantage of by some who can afford fancy accounting schemes.
Karen, is there anything in that language that makes you think the finance minister is inappropriately demonizing people in the business community?
Yes, there's much about that language that I think is inappropriate. That language is vague. The minister talks about some gaining a benefit over others. The minister talks about the wealthy and the middle class. None of those terms are defined. They are intolerably vague, in my opinion. He also speaks about closing loopholes. I think he said that in that clip. And again, I would say that to describe what he's doing as closing loopholes or to restore fairness to the system, these are value-laden terms that nobody would disagree with, stripped down from any context. And it frames the debate so that the government is appearing to be the benevolent fixer of the system, whereas, as we've been discussing, what we're actually seeing is wholesale tax reform that affects people who squarely would place themselves within the middle class and who aren't necessarily high income or would consider themselves as part of the select few.
David, I know you support what the finance minister is doing, but are you concerned that in using some of the language he has used, he has demonized people who up until now have not felt like criminals, but are feeling portrayed that way right now?
I think closing tax loopholes, whether, irrespective of the language that you use, is going to get people pretty excited. There's a very concentrated benefit here of high net worth individuals who make the most benefit from this, and they've got a lot of incentives to push back against changes that are going to make them pay more in tax. So if you're a doctor and you're income splitting with your spouse and you're saving $25,000 a year, well, you've got a pretty strong incentive to put your hand up and say, I don't agree with these changes for whatever reason. And so, we could argue about whether, the language was good, but I think at the end of the day, there's a strong financial incentive to the people who are gaining advantage from these particular systems, income splitting, as well as
David, let me jump
systems.
in. Since you said we can argue about it, let's jump in and argue about it. I mean, using words like exploiting or fancy accounting schemes or loopholes, I mean, do they have a point in feeling targeted by this?
Well, I think what you want to do is you want to separate out income splitters from small business owners. So you've got a group of folks that are using the small business tax structure as a means to just reduce their tax bill, such that somebody else can make up that difference for the fact that they don't want to pay their tax bill, thinking of professionals here, and separating that out from small business owners that make, $50,000, $60,000 and would see no benefit whatsoever from income splitting because they don't make enough and because the family structure isn't the right structure to make money off of it. I think that seems to me a better use of the reasonableness test is cleaving off small business owners from income splitters or people that want their own private retirement system.
Dan, make a bit of a list for us, if you would, about the specific kinds of professions, business owners who would feel particularly targeted by these tax changes.
I wish that I could. We at CFIB just started together with 62 other business associations, a coalition of groups trying to speak out against these changes. It includes everything from agriculture to plumbing association, retailers, restaurants. All sectors of the economy are equally targeted by this. I think in the government's head that this is going after the high-income professionals that are splitting income, often doctors particularly because they're paid often by the public purse. But in fact, the changes that they are proposing affect absolutely everyone. The other most critical thing that we're trying to communicate to the government right now, and they seem absolutely unwilling to listen to it, is that these changes are not just bringing up the total corporate tax burden, the business income burden, to the same level of an employee, but in many cases making that burden higher and much higher than that of an employee. Some of the changes suggest the income tax burden would be 73% on income, and even here in Ontario with ridiculously high taxes on individuals, the burden maxes out about 53, 54%. So we're talking about having people pay much higher rates than is the case for employees, And on top of that, these changes affect businesses of all income levels. Only a few of the changes are targeted at the high-income professionals. Most of them affect business owners, as was suggested earlier. You could have $50,000 or $75,000 of business income and still be affected by these changes.
Tammy, let me get you in here and have you weigh in on, if Dan's right, how detrimental do you think, once all of this shakes out through the economy, how detrimental can it be to the economic performance of the country?
Well, I think there's some important things to think about here. Clearly, there's a broad range of small businesses that will be affected by this, and I don't doubt that there are many small businesses in that $70,000 to $150,000 range that will be affected. There was a great presentation yesterday. Jack Mintz had put up an interesting graph showing that 70% of the value of the small business deduction in Ontario is going to households who have an income over $200,000 per year. Now, there were references there to everyone below that 200,000 as middle class. I agree with Karen. We'd love to see definitions of these things. But it's statistical information like that that is suggesting that the bulk of the individuals who are being affected by this are in that upper income range. And I think it's important to really think about that big picture.
Well, should we do a real life example here? Karen, let me bring you in. You're a lawyer, right?
Correct.
Are you incorporated?
I just incorporated 4 months ago.
Seems kind of pointless now, doesn't it?
It does.
Do you income sprinkle?
No.
You don't. So why did you incorporate?
Well, I did incorporate with the hope and expectation that I would be able to income split, but with these proposals coming through, I will not be able to do that.
So can you give us a sense about the financial hit you expect to take if these tax changes come in?
Can I put a number on it? No, but I do have a husband with whom I would be able to income split if the proposals did not go through. And I do fall within the group of people who sees this. I mean, my husband has supported me through all of the changes in my career as I've gone laterally and upward. He has borne the risk of all of my career changes. He's certainly bearing the risk of the fact that I'm an entrepreneur now. My firm does employ 3 small people, or sorry, my small firm employs 3 people. You know, I understand the policy that is behind the income splitting rules right now. So I wouldn't feel bad if I were to take advantage of those rules. If the rules change, that's fine. I accept that too.
Dan, let me go to you then, following up on Karen. Is it possible, and again, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth here, but is it possible that with these tax changes in place, Karen's going to have less money? She might not hire somebody she might otherwise have hired going forward?
That's exactly what we're hearing from business owners across the country right now, is that the rules of the game are changing and their overall burden of taxation will increase. That's got to have an impact on the ground for business owners that are looking to grow their businesses, continue in business. Some of the incentives that we've put in place, because this isn't just about income sprinkling, this is also about saving money within your business through passive income rules. This is also about taking money out when you retire from your business through capital gains. These are a broad number of changes that are going to go into effect, and they are going to throw almost every business structure for an incorporated business, and as pointed out, we've got lots of them in Canada, into chaos for the next few years at a time where the economy's finally just starting to poke its nose out of the ground. We have on top of that Canada Pension Plan premium increases for the next 5 years, carbon taxes or carbon pricing going up for the next 5 years starting in 2018. Yesterday they announced that there's going to be an employment insurance increase of about 2%. These burdens that are at minimum wage and labor changes in at least three of Canada's biggest provinces, these changes are going to take a toll on business owners, and you add the uncertainty that this creates on top of NAFTA and everything else. I got to tell you, it seems crazy to me that the government is going down this road, and it seems motivated by a political motivation, not by a fairness motivation.
More on that in a second. David, let me get you to weigh in on this issue. If the effect of all of these tax changes is to deprive these companies of the money that they might otherwise use to hire people, do you think we'll be any further ahead at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, there's a flip side to this, of course, which is that for every professional that wants to save $25,000 on their tax bill and not pay that $25,000 in tax, well, somebody has to make that difference up, right? Somebody working minimum wage, somebody in the middle class who doesn't have a CCPC has to pay more in tax or receive less in services because some wealthy professional doesn't want to, some income splitter doesn't want to pay their fair share of the tax bill. And that's the flip side, is that as you deprive the tax system, it's not just small business folks that work hard in Canada. It's not small business folks alone that takes risks in Canada. It's a lot of Canadians who support their partners as they go back to school, who work at minimum wage, who work seasonal work. And these folks gain no benefit from any of this, and they're much more likely to be low income. And so I think it bears remembering that this is only available to small businesses, and it's only at its maximum benefit to small business owners that make a lot of money. Those are the folks that are the primary beneficiaries of income splitting and your own personal retirement savings. I mean, if you've got $30,000 a year to save, and you want to save more than that, I mean, that's the maximum for everybody else under the RSP TFSA system, and you want to save more than that, is that really something the government should be giving you a tax break on? You've got a lot of money going into a retirement structure. Or if you want to income split and you make $300,000, is that really the best use of the government's $25,000 check that they're sending you in essence? Or would that money be better spent, driving growth for folks that work at low income or folks that are middle class that don't have a small business?
Dan, you want to come back on that?
Well, sure. I mean, some of those arguments suggest that all of the business income belongs to government, other than the portion the government benevolently allows you to keep, which is insulting on the surface. But we also have to remember that about the reasons why there's a lower rate of taxation on small business in the first place. And that is that small firms have a more difficult time accessing bank financing. So any tax savings that they or the family has can be reinvested in growing the business, which has good societal outcomes attached to it, and good for employees, good for taxpayers, growing the base altogether. On top of that, business owners have a much higher incidence of costs associated with tax compliance. So they have all the same rules and regulations that a big firm has to contend with, but they have to do it on a much smaller base. And these are some of the reasons why we have these provisions in place. If we want to change that and to say, you know what, we want to make sure that it's less lucrative for people to go into business in the first place, we have to accept that there are going to be broad consequences for us as a nation. And those consequences are not going to be particularly great for that minimum wage worker either.
Speaking of consequences, Tammy, I want to bring you in on the issue of political consequences here. I know we don't have 4 political scientists on the program tonight, but I also know that all of you have political views on what's going on right now. And I wonder what you think the potential political consequences will be to the federal government, admittedly 2 years away from the next federal election, but still, probably more conversations I've heard in the last few weeks on how this represents the end of the Trudeau honeymoon than I've heard at any other time during the 2 years he's been in power. What do you see as the potential consequences for the Prime Minister and his party?
Well, we know that economists are not well known for telling people what they want to hear. But when we think about that clip from Mr. Murnau, I would have chosen some better words there, I think. What's really interesting here is that we've had a good opportunity to think about the objectives of these principles. And, this was stated very clearly, that this is about businesses trying to accumulate capital to invest in their businesses and grow. And when you go back to that original 1971 budget speech, this is the politics of it, it spoke very, very clearly to the fact that these provisions are not meant to be used for non-business purposes, and specifically pointed to portfolio investments. But what the good thing about the conversation over the past 2 months is that we've seen a great discussion about the various objectives that people want to see met. We talk about risk, we talk about things like women trying to handle maternity leaves and starting up these careers. We talk about people retirement planning. And we could have entire shows on each of those subjects and trying to think about the best policy to meet those objectives. And I think at the end of that show, we're not going to come to the conclusion that these provisions are the best policy for the job.
Karen, I want to go back to politics here, though. I think the Liberals have got, have they got every single seat in Atlantic Canada? I want to know whether you think any of that's at risk by bringing in these new tax changes that have been proposed.
Oh, well, I think it certainly could be. We've already seen some Liberal MPs in New Brunswick come out against these changes, and I think that we're going to find that individuals across the political spectrum, Conservative and Liberal, are affected by this. Everybody's reaching out to their MPs. At least we're certainly encouraging people to reach out to their MPs, and I know there's been a strong surge of communications directly to the MPs since this has come out. So I certainly see some risk.
David, we've heard Wayne Easter, who's a longtime member of Parliament from Prince Edward Island, say that he thought the communications rollout on this was quote-unquote god-awful. We know for a fact that many Liberal MPs are getting an earful from constituents about this kind of thing. What do you think the price the Liberals will have to pay on this may be?
Yeah, Mr. Easter was not happy about the communications on this for sure. I think that there's been a lot of pushback. That's very clear. I mean, there's a very small group of folks that gain a lot of benefit from income splitting or from creating their own private retirement systems, and they don't want to pay more in tax. And so there's a strong incentive for them to call their MP and say, I don't like this. And so, if Dan and the small businesses and the professional organizations are successful in stopping these changes, I think what you'll see is a continued acceleration in small business formation, because it'll be quite clear that the government is not going to come after you if you decide to income split, and that if you have any means to go down this road, you probably should. In essence, this has been a big billboard to anybody who's a professional and could be structured this way, that if these changes don't go through, they should go form a small business because they're the ones not saving money on their tax bill. When everybody else is, in essence.
Dan, I got an email the other day from a consultant who said to me he was very happy to vote Liberal in 2015. He gave money to the party in 2015, and then he said at the end of the email, never again. And I think it was in all caps. He was pretty serious about it. Having said that, the next election's 2 years away federally. Yeah. Are you worried that some of your members are going to lose their moral indignation over the next 2 years on this?
Well, for a tax policy issue as specific and as complicated as this, to have dominated headlines for as many weeks as it has, I think is pretty significant. And that's because business owners not only feel like the policy is bad, but the communication, as Wayne Easter has said, is absolutely worse than that. The business community is going nuts. And just let's define how big a group we're talking about here. There are 1.1 million small business owners in Canada with paid staff. If you include the self-employed, that's 3.5 million Canadians that are subject to these changes, either as incorporated businesses now or potentially incorporated businesses in the future.
They all vote.
These are voters. These are also influential members of their community. The business community, I think there are a lot of Canadians that think that somehow if you have a business in Canada, you've set up a license to print money and that your life must be easy as you drift off to your cottage in your luxury car. The reality of the business community is so much different than that. And I think that MPs, particularly those closer to the ground, in rural communities especially, they're starting to recognize that this is causing a big cleavage between themselves and their voters. I think that could be costly to many in government right now. I'm very pleased to see 6 Liberal MPs that have spoken out against these changes. We've got NDP MPs against these changes. Governments of all political stripes have supported small businesses in the past. In fact, the NDP in Manitoba was the first government in the country to eliminate taxation on small and medium-sized firms. And so this isn't a political issue, but it's quickly becoming one.
Well, we have heard, Karen, I'll go to you on this. We have heard one cabinet minister the other day say, it's not enough to complain. If you don't like the tax changes we're proposing, come and give us a better idea of something that you prefer. So, okay, let's do that right now. You don't like what's on offer right now? What's a better way?
I think the better way is actually to go back to the drawing board. I think that it would not be a bad time in our history to look at our entire taxation system, not only the taxation system for Canadian-controlled private corporations, but the whole thing. And if we're going to do tax reform, let's do it right. Let's look at what we want the tax system to incentivize. Let's look at where the abuses are. Let's look at some of the other values that should be reflected in a tax system. It should be simple. It should be easy to comply with. It should be as neutral as possible. It should be as certain as possible. Let's go back to the drawing board and look at what we want our tax system to do. Let's have a proper process of consultation and research, and let's let's get it right from the beginning. To put this through now in 75 days under the guise of it being a loophole closing, I honestly believe that'd be a tragedy for our country to do what the government's proposing for the reasons that it says it's proposing.
Tammy, I've got 30 seconds left. Can you tell me what, if not this, what else?
Well, I think there needs to be a better proposal being brought forward by the business community. That's an important thing at this stage. We want to ensure that we have a neutral tax system, one that still supports small businesses in accumulating their capital and building their businesses, but not one that's going to incentivize businesses to incorporate for the sake of saving on our taxes. That's really a goal here, and we need to see a proposal that's going to accomplish that if people think this one isn't the right one.
Terrific. Thanks to all of you for coming on TVO tonight for this discussion. That was Tammy Sherrill from Wilfrid Laurier University, David McDonald from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Karen Stillwell, partner at Connors Stillwell in Fredericton, New Brunswick, and of course Dan Kelly, former voice of the St. Louis Blues. No, wait, wrong Dan Kelly. President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. Great to have you all on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.